Alright, so I'm back once again. After I did that Hasselblad video, I started thinking about how many cameras I've owned and gotten rid of, and there have been quite a few. And I'm going to do some more videos, kind of like the Hasselblad one, where I talk about cameras I owned for a while and liked, but just kind of eventually parted with because I got something newer or better, or I kind of outgrew the camera, or realized that it had very niche purposes that didn't really fill my needs. But in this video, I'm going to talk about basically a bunch of cameras that I bought on a whim and either never used them at all or used them extremely rarely and eventually sold them when I came to my senses. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about any of them because, like I said, some of them I never really used, and even the ones I used, I often just put like 1 or 2 rolls of film through them, or I mounted the lens on like a Sony A7 and did some test shots and never really took it out and did much with it. So I'm just going to go over a few of these. I have a short list here, not too many of them. I'll provide some images of the camera so you can kind of see what they look like. But I think this is kind of an interesting video to just kind of talk about camera collecting to some extent, and how we get attached to cameras sometimes, and maybe we shouldn't, and some things like that I'll kind of sum up at the end of the video. So to start this list off, as we'll call it, I'm going to start with the Voigtlander Bessa. And I bought one of these, as most people do, with a 25mm f4 lens and the corresponding viewfinder. And when I bought this camera, it seemed really cool and exotic. It was not a very common camera. I kind of liked the idea of having a really wide-angle lens and a zone-focusing camera, but when I used it, I was just disappointed. I didn't think the lens was that great. I found it was very hard to focus. When I had it out, I remember a couple of times the little viewfinder on top kind of got knocked off, and I dropped it and it got scratched up, just the plastic sides, not the actual glass part. And I was not really blown away by it. I'd like to say more, but I shot a couple of rolls of film with it, and I just didn't really see any worthwhile images. End of story. The next one is the Olympus Pen. This will be the only half-frame camera on the list, the only one I've ever used or owned, and probably the only one I'd ever really want to own. I got this at a thrift store. Seemed kind of cool. Price was pretty good. Took it home and tried it out. It seemed to work okay. Took it out and shot with it. Didn't really seem to focus properly, and then I just kind of got over it because it just, half-frame cameras are, in my mind, kind of a cheap gimmick, and I mean that both literally and figuratively, because you have this idea that, oh, I'm gonna get twice as many shots in one roll, but then they end up being this awkward kind of narrow vertical format that's just not very appealing or usable. And I know there's some people out there who love half-frame cameras, especially the Olympus Pens, but I just think it's kind of a weird gimmick that I don't think most people really appreciate. On to the next camera, another Olympus, another well-loved Olympus, an OM1, and I had a few lenses with this. I had the 50-1.8, the 28 f2.8, and a 135 f3.5. I bought this camera really cheap with the 28 and the 50 at a thrift store, kind of with the intent of selling it. I kept it around for a while, wanting to use it. It was incredibly well built and just had a great feel to it. I picked up the 135 at another thrift store a little bit later at a pretty good price with a set of filters, if I remember correctly. And I ended up selling all of them. I made a little profit. And that was kind of my goal in the end, and I think that's kind of one of the reasons I never really used it. It was a really nice camera, but around the same time I had a Canon A1 program, and the Nikon FM2T, and I had a few lenses of those, and I think that those cameras were as good or better, and I think the lenses were as good or better, and I just never really had a need for this camera, and I kind of bought it with the intent of selling it for a profit, and that's what I did. Next up, we're on to a Canon, the A1. I bought this Canon A1, and I was told it was broken. It did have a sort of a defect where the battery just drained really quickly for no particular reason, and these are electronic shutter cameras, so when the battery dies, they're useless. But it came with a 50mm f1.4 lens, which is what I was really after. So I got it, and the 50mm f1.4 lens was really nice. I used it a couple of times on my Canon AE1, not a whole lot, but a few times, but I will say it is vastly superior to the older 50 f1.8. It focuses closer, has much more appealing bokeh, just sharper image quality in general, all around better lens. It's worth every penny. The original 50 f1.8s that are sold with most Canon cameras really aren't that impressive, but the 51.4 is amazing. It was easily on par with or better than anything Nikon made. I'm not going to go on about it too much longer because I'm talking more about the camera, but long story short, the camera's broken. I essentially got it for free. I plopped an old 50mm f1.8 lens on it, which I had a couple of, and I sold it for a small profit, so it is what it is. Next up is the Yashica Electro 35. I don't know exactly what submodel it was. I picked this up again at a thrift store, really cheap. Looked kind of neat, so I sold it. That was pretty much it. I had it around for a while. Didn't really do much with it. So next up is the Polaroid SX70. This is a camera that looked really cool. It folds up, it unfolds, it's Polaroid. It looked really cool. Bought it really cheap at a thrift store. I thought, hey, this is neat. Kind of cleaned it up some because it had this weird kind of crust on it when I got it. It was pretty gross now that I think about it in retrospect. Don't even really want to know what it was. I got home and looked at the price of the that SX70 style Polaroid film, and it is absurd. So I quickly sold the camera, made a bit of a profit, called it a day. Next up is the Mamiya TLR, which is a pretty interesting camera, and this is the original Mamiya C, I guess a C1. It's a little bit different than the C3s that are a lot more common, somewhat rare. It had the 80mm f2.8 lens and the 135mm f3.5 lens. And I got this. It was big and heavy, so I never really carried it around with me. I had some accessories that looked really cool. The thing about it is I wanted to test it and try it out, but I didn't have a ton of 120 film around. And as I've said before, it's a little on the costly side. So I wasn't going to run out and just buy a whole bunch of test rolls and do a bunch of test shots, especially because with a camera like this, you have the view window on top, which pretty much shows you what your final image is going to be. So just playing around with it, I had a very good idea of what it would do. I will say this camera was very impressive. The bellows extend out really far, so you can focus really close, like much closer than you can with the Rolleiflex or any of the Rolleiflexes that I've kind of played around with. So it is an impressive camera in some ways, but it's big, it's heavy. I sold it to a friend of mine for a pretty good profit. I kind of had an intent of buying this camera and selling it for profit, and that's ultimately what I did, even though I was kind of tempted to use it. He really likes it. He actually says that even though I say it's big and heavy, he says it's one of the smaller and lighter medium format cameras he owns, which I guess could be true. I haven't owned tons of medium format cameras, and most of the ones I have owned have been kind of small and lightweight. Like the Hasselblad was very small. The Mamiya 7 is relatively small, and it's very lightweight compared to most of them. It's got a very plasticky build. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Interesting camera, but not one that really struck a fancy for me. So next up is a lens. This was a Voigtlander Helar Mark III, and I got the lens with all the little accessories, even the viewfinder. I had some idea of kind of mounting this on a Leica. Never got a Leica, so I ended up getting an E-mount converter and mounting it on my Sony A7. I took it out and shot with it a couple of times and just realized it was kind of too wide. It's a fun lens to use every once in a while, but even for landscape work, I just found it was a little bit too wide. There were a few scenarios where I used it and I thought, hey, that's okay. And I didn't really think that the characteristics of the lens were all that great. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't really good. So yeah, I just parted with it. I didn't really make much of a profit on that one because it was kind of expensive when I bought it. It was more of a break even, but I did part with it because I just didn't feel like I really needed it, and I've always had a thing for wide-angle lenses, but that was one of the last really wide-angle lenses I owned and sold, and it kind of made me get over my whole wide-angle fixation. I still like a nice wide-angle lens, but I've realized that a 28mm is really good enough for most things I want. And I think it's probably good enough for most people, and even if you want something really wide, I think probably like a 24 or 21 is substantial. Going into these 15mm lenses, I think it's really too wide for most applications, but that's just kind of my opinion. And as I'm making this list, I actually remember there's another camera that's not on here. I briefly owned an Argus C3, and again, I picked it up really cheap at a thrift store. I sold it to somebody I knew, made a little bit of a profit. Never really had much of an intent of using it. It just looked kind of neat, and I'm just now remembering that I actually had that. I forgot about it. So that's another one I can add to the list, a bonus hidden secret camera. So yeah. One takeaway from this list is that there's something called GAS that I think all photographers have heard of. It's short for Gear Acquisition Syndrome. And it's basically when you just get obsessed with buying gear and acquiring things and sort of collecting things, so to speak. Everybody thinks they're a collector because they pile a bunch of stuff up in a corner or back room, but I always feel like that's kind of ham-fisted logic. I think it's kind of dangerous to just keep buying and buying stuff and thinking that somehow you're accomplishing something or you're making yourself better by just buying stuff, because you're kind of lying to yourself and you're really just wasting money, and also you're kind of wasting time. If you really want to be a better photographer, I think you're better off investing in some sort of training, or really just going out and shooting. I think that's the best thing you can do, is just go out and shoot. Use what you have and go out and shoot. Mix it up every once in a while. It's fine to have more than one camera. I can totally understand if somebody has a Canon camera with a couple lenses and a Nikon camera with a couple lenses and then some sort of compact camera. It makes perfect sense. You know, I have a whole bunch of Nikon rangefinders. I got no excuse. I've got a pile of those cameras and lenses, and then I have some Nikon f-mount gear, and I have some digital gear, and I have some medium format stuff. I have way more gear than I need. I know it. So I've actually been considering getting rid of some. And I say that as I remember I ordered something not long ago, so that's probably not a completely accurate statement. But what I'm saying is, you know, be careful. Don't get too obsessed with this whole gear acquisition syndrome. And if you are having a problem with it, you know, just contact me. And I would be more than happy to take some of that gear off your hands and dispose of it in any way possible. Just send it to me. It doesn't matter how much. Doesn't matter what condition. I'll take care of it for you. So I think I'm going to call it a day on this video. Hopefully somebody was able to take something away from this. I don't know for sure, but I thought it was kind of an interesting list just to talk about how many cameras I've owned and never even really used. It kind of opened my eyes some. So everybody just consider that before you go out and buy more gear.